Hello and welcome. I'm Kip Davis, a biblical scholar and a specialist in early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is my fourth response video to Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy and his presentation on the Capturing Christianity channel last year titled The Reliability of Genesis 1-11. As I pointed out in the last video, Jones hand waves at the consensus scholarship on the Pentateuch, which holds that Genesis and the other four books at the beginning of the Old Testament were actually cobbled together from earlier, long since disappeared sources. He is no different from other pop apologists on this topic. Instead of grappling with the evidence that scholars find so convincing for it, he has preferred to oversimplify the broad ideas into something ridiculous and then attempts to argue from loosely defined literary critical notions about artistry or internal coherence and the like sort. Because Jones spends virtually no time or energy engaging with the actual theories that he is attempting to discredit, it is necessary in this video to step away from him for a minute in order to get into why the documentary hypothesis has found so much support from scholars for so long. If you've not already done so, I encourage you to go back and to watch the other videos in this series and, of course, take some time to view Jones's video in its entirety to ensure that I'm not misrepresenting him. In this video, I will get to the heart of the matter by showing some of the most compelling evidence for the source theories. So let's not dally and get into it. There are numerous very good descriptions of the documentary hypothesis that are easily accessible to all readers. Any good introductory textbook to Old Testament studies will have a clear description of the rationale behind the source theories, their development, features, and even critical shortcomings. Perhaps the best known of these concise treatments appears in John J. Collins's masterful Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, which is on its third edition now. A more lengthy narratological description appears in James Kugel's 2007 book, How to Read the Bible, A Guide to Scripture Then and Now. I have drawn extensively from these two resources, among others, in the preliminary matters, but moving forward, I shall offer a selective view of some of what I consider to be the most compelling bits of evidence for the existence of earlier sources of the Pentateuch. In addition to these resources, there are also a handful of excellent descriptions and discussions of the documentary hypothesis here on YouTube. Most notably, Josh Bowen and Megan Lewis have at least one terrific video on the topic on their Digital Hammurabi channel. It's a 90-minute conversation with Yale Divinity School expert Joel Baden. And of course, Baden has also written a truly excellent book about the documentary hypothesis. I thought there were two videos, but I couldn't seem to find the other one on their channel. Please be sure to take the time to watch these videos and to support Digital Hammurabi. So, to begin, the first task is to clean up Jones's ham-fisted description of the sources of the Pentateuch themselves. The first of these are the Yahwist or J source and the Elohist or E source, so named because of their preference of terminology for identifying God in the text. Not all scholars are agreed on the distinction between these sources, but they are commonly regarded as the earliest, stemming from some time in the early Iron Age before the reign of King Hezekiah and the end of the Northern Kingdom in 722 BCE. The third source is the Deuteronomic source, or D, and it is restricted to only the book of Deuteronomy. This was a document of royal propaganda, drawing on earlier material that was written during the reign of Josiah in Jerusalem as a means to legitimate his sweeping religious reforms in 620 BCE. Finally, the priestly source, or P. While there are lively debates about the antiquity of several portions of P, most would agree that P represents the latest layers of the Pentateuch, and some believe that the writer of P was responsible for compiling all the sources in a single document most closely representing that which survives today. Most of P appears in Leviticus, But the strong influence of P is seen throughout the entire Pentateuch in the form of skillful and often brilliant editorial stitching of the traditions together in a magisterial narrative. Most of the modern evangelical arguments for the internal consistency of the Pentateuch depend heavily on how carefully the final editor structured the sources together. That is, most of their arguments stem from the editorial work of P, which frequently appears like a veneer of single authorship. Some scholars, like Richard Elliott Friedman, have claimed to date the individual sources on the basis of the historical development of the Hebrew language or on the prevalence of their usage by individual Hebrew prophets, but I will set my focus on the most consistently demonstrated 4 pieces of evidence. First, the existence of numerous doublets throughout the Pentateuch. Second, the terminological continuity within the individual sources themselves. Third, the thematic and theological continuity also within the individual sources. And fourth, the narratological continuity observed within the sources. Collins, in his Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, provides an extensive but not exhaustive list of doublets within the Pentateuch, that is, double versions of the same story or event. These include 2 creation stories, 2 distinguishable flood stories intertwined in Genesis 6-9, 2 stories of Abraham, Sarah, and a foreign king, along with a 3rd story, but featuring Abraham's son Isaac and his wife Rebekah. There are 2 stories of God's covenant with Abraham. There are 2 stories of Abraham's treatment of his concubine Hagar and their son Ishmael. There are 2 stories of the naming of Beersheba. In each of these doublets, there is an uninterrupted consistency. In one, God is always identified as Yahweh. In the counterpart, he always self-identifies and is identified by characters within the story as El or Elohim. In the stories featuring Abraham and his family, there are further uninterrupted patterns. In one, he is called Abraham, and in the other, Abraham. Likewise, his wife in one is called Sarai, while in the other, she is Sarah. But moving beyond Genesis, there are 2 accounts with further editorial insertions of the Red Sea crossing in Exodus 14, 1-30 and 15, 1-19. Multiple versions of the 10 Commandments, and 2 lists of forbidden animals, and so on and so forth. Let's take a closer look at one of these doublets. The story of Hagar and Ishmael, according to J in Genesis 16, and the E version in chapter 21. In the J story, Sarai's slave girl, Hagar, is given to Abram so that he might impregnate her in order to have a son in his old age. When Hagar conceives, she grows disrespectful of her owner, Sarai. Sarai says to Abram, "The wrongdoing committed against me is on you. I gave my own slave girl into your care, and once she conceived, I became a curse in her eyes. Yahweh will judge between me and you." Abram responded, "Look, she is your slave girl, under your authority. Do whatever is best in your eyes with her." So, Sarai badly mistreated Hagar to the point that she ran away. We are then told that the angel of Yahweh finds Hagar by a wilderness spring on the way to Shur. He says to her, "Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, from whence have you come and where are you going?" Hagar responds, "I am fleeing from Sarai, my owner." The angel then says, "Return to your owner and submit yourself under her power." He continues, "I will surely make your offspring so great that their numbers cannot be counted. See, you are pregnant. You will give birth to a son and will call him Ishmael because Yahweh has heard your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man. his hand on everyone and everyone's hand on him. He will live at odds with all his brothers. Then there is this somewhat cryptic detail told at the end of the story. Hagar called the name of Yahweh El Roi because, in her words, I have seen after he saw me. Some translations, like the NRSV, have rendered this as an exclamation that Hagar continued to live after having seen God. The story ends with a note that this place is so called Bir Lahai Roi, in memoriam of this incident. Hagar returns to Sarai and gives birth to a son whom she calls Ishmael. The story is very similar in the broad strokes, but there are also significant differences. The story begins some time after Ishmael was born and very shortly after Sarah, not Sarai, had given birth to her own son, Isaac. Sarah saw Ishmael playing with Isaac and says to Abraham, not Abram, get rid of this slave and her son. The son of this slave will not inherit with my son, with Isaac. Abraham is saddened by this because he loves his son Ishmael. But then God, that is, Elohim, speaks to Abraham. Do not worry about the boy and your slave. Listen to all that Sarah has said to you, because it is in Isaac that your offspring will be called. But I will also establish the son of the slave to be a great nation, because he is your offspring. So Abraham arises in the morning. He gives bread and a satchel of water to Hagar and Ishmael, and sends them away to wander in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water is gone, Hagar abandons the child under a shrub and sits at some distance away, and said, I cannot bear to look upon the death of the child. Then she raised her voice and cried out in mourning. Then God hears the voice of the child, and the angel of God calls out to Hagar from the sky. He says, What's with you, Hagar? Don't be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the child from where he is. Stand up, take the boy, and protect him with your hand upon him, for I will establish him to be a great nation. We are then told that God reveals to Hagar a spring where she refills her satchel and gives her son water. The story ends on the happy note that God was with the boy and he grew to become an archer, living in the wilderness of Paran. The two stories are similar enough to show that there is a common tradition behind them. Hagar invokes the jealousy of her owner by means of her having a son with Abram, or Abraham. Hagar is driven out into the wilderness, where she has an encounter with God at a spring, and where God promises that her son, Ishmael, will father a great nation. But there are significant differences also between the stories. Hagar is still pregnant in the first, but Ishmael has already been born in the second. Sarai is upset by Hagar's behavior toward her in the first, but then Sarah is triggered by the thought of her son sharing his inheritance with the child of a slave in the second. Abram responds with contempt toward pregnant Hagar in the first, but Abraham has affection for the boy Ishmael in the second. Hagar runs away in the first because of Sarai's abuse, whereas in the second, Sarah demands that she and her child be banished. Hagar arrives at a well in the first, and the well is miraculously revealed to her in the second. She is instructed to return to her owner in the first, but we are told nothing of her whereabouts in the second, except that Ishmael eventually settles in Paran. There are also notable differences between the two stories which reveal something about their sources. In the first, God is identified as Yahweh, where in the second, he is called Elohim. The characters, Sarai and Abram in the first, are called Sarah and Abraham in the second. The angel of Yahweh in the first speaks face to face with Hagar, while the angel of God speaks to her from the sky. As we will come to discover, the way in which God interacts with people is consistently different in J than it is in E, or especially in P. But this repeated story is different enough in its second telling that the editor was able to turn what was almost certainly two versions of the same event into two separate, similar happenings. The name changes are explained as part of the covenant that God makes with Abraham in Genesis 17, and the age difference between the pregnant Hagar and Hagar the mother provides for the plausibility within the combined narrative that they are now entirely separate incidents. Quite often, where we can detect the presence of the distinct sources of the Pentateuch, we can also see how cleverly the editor chose to combine them to make some sense, but not always. Even well beyond the usage of terms to identify God, there are numerous other words or phrases throughout the Pentateuch which quite clearly correspond to the divisions proposed by scholars between sources. According to Friedman, certain words and phrases occur disproportionately or even entirely in one source but not in the others. The quantity of such terms that consistently belong to a particular source is considerable. The argument is not merely that certain terms are more frequent in one source than another, but rather that these terms can be divided along lines which show exclusive usage in one source, most particularly in P, to the preclusion of all the others. The list of some of these provided by Friedman is quite extensive. Examples of these, starting with the early sources, J and E, are as follows. The mountain where God met with Moses and delivered to him the Ten Commandments is called Sinai in J and also in P, but is identified as Horeb in E and in D. Moses' father-in-law is called Ruel in J, but then Jethro in P and E. The euphemistic use of the verb yada, meaning to know, for sexual intercourse occurs exclusively in J. The word Sheol, the place of the dead, occurs only in J. The expressions Adonai Lishkan Shemo Sham or Adonai Lishom Shemo Sham, the place where Yahweh tents or sets his name, are exclusive to D. The phrase Bekol Levavaka Uvkol Nafshecha, with your entire heart and your entire soul, occurs only in D. The phrase Vishma Adonai Echol, listen to the voice of Yahweh, occurs only in D. The expression Be'etzem Hayom Hazeh, on that very day, is used exclusively in P. The euphemistic phrase Ne'asaf el Amiv, gathered to his people, appears exclusively in P. The one appearance at the end of Deuteronomy is part of an epilogue that scholars unanimously agree to have been written by a later editor. Most would concur that this editor was either the author of P or heavily influenced by him. The expression Paru Uravu, be fruitful and multiply, occurs only in P. The word Edah, meaning congregation, occurs 102 times in the Pentateuch, and every single instance belongs to P. This list is far from exhaustive, but provides a sense for how scholars have identified the sources of the Pentateuch. Most particularly, these sorts of terminological distinctions demonstrate the significant unlikelihood that the author of Deuteronomy was the same as the author of Genesis and Exodus. Moreover, it shows that the same author of Leviticus also either wrote or redacted substantial portions of all of the other books of the Torah except for Deuteronomy. For most evangelical apologists, their investigation of the documentary hypothesis starts and ends with Jean Astruc's observation about the different names for God, Yahweh and Elohim. Friedman illustrates the depth of the argument by going beyond just the mere usage of the words as points of distinction, and rather speaks of dividing the sources on the basis of consistencies within their own content. The point is not that the sources have different names for God. The point is that the different sources have different ideas of when the name Yahweh was first revealed to humans. As Friedman points out, J explicitly states that people began to invoke the name of Yahweh in the very distant past, long before the flood. Whereas, according to P and possibly E, God did not reveal his name until generations after the flood to Moses in Exodus 3 verses 13 to 15. Thus you shall speak to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This shall be my name forever, this my appellation for all eternity. Moreover, EP goes on to state that prior to God's revelation to Moses, he was known by another name, El Shaddai. In Genesis 17:1, God identifies himself to Abraham thusly, I am El Shaddai, walk in my ways and be blameless. Then again in Exodus 6 verses 2 to 3, EP is much more precise about the identity of God. I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name Yahweh. Throughout E and P, God is identified most often simply as El, the same ruling deity in the Canaanite pantheon, or Elohim. Friedman makes another clarifying point in this. While the word Elohim does appear in dialogue in J, the J narrator is consistent in using only Yahweh to identify God. He summarizes the name distinction in the sources as follows. The names Yahweh and El and the word God, Elohim, occur more than 2,000 times, and the number of exceptions to this picture is 3. Despite this phenomenal fact, we still find writers on this subject asserting that the names of God do not prove anything. But there is a lot more to it. In addition to the consistency with which each of these sources, J and E or P, presents God, there are aspects of the narrative that likewise appear consistent to only one or two of the sources, and to the exclusion of all of the others. These items of consistency are non-trivial for identifying the boundaries between the sources, but they also easily conflate when one simply reads the text from start to finish. This also because of how skillfully the writer of P or another redactor and the later editors stitch together the sources to create something like the Pentateuch that we know today. One of these areas of consistency is in the appearance and presentation of sacred objects. The Mishkan, or the Tabernacle, also called the Ohel Moed, the Tent of Meeting, is of extreme importance to P, where it is mentioned nearly 300 times, but it never appears in J or D. Furthermore, the tabernacle is presented in P as the only place where sacrifices are permitted, where ceremonies are to be performed, and it is the only place where revelation is received after Yahweh's appearance to the Israelites at Mount Sinai. Similarly, J and P are the only sources to make mention of the divine creatures Cheruvim. In J, they are depicted stationed at the entrance of the Garden of Eden, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 24, and in P, carved golden cherubs are mentioned several times as guardians over the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant. Special divining stones known as the Urim and the Tumim, literally the lights and perfections, make their only appearance in P. They are never mentioned in J or E. One of the ways in which some scholars argue for the existence of E, especially as it is distinct from P, is in the occurrence of miracles. In E, these are performed using Moses' staff, whereas in P, miracles are performed through the high priest Aaron's staff. There are distinctly different appraisals of the priesthood in Israel that appear in P and in D. In P, only the sons of Aaron, the Bnei Aharon, are regarded as officiating priests. They are the only ones sanctioned to perform the burnt offerings in Leviticus 6, 1, verses 9 to 24. According to Numbers 17:5, that's 1640 in the English, the sons of Aaron are distinguished from outsiders. No outsider who is not a descendant of Aaron may offer sacrifices of incense before Yahweh. They are the ones who handle the Urim and the Tumim. In Leviticus 21, the sons of Aaron are explicitly identified as the only priests who require ritual purification. Yahweh said to Moses, "Speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, HaKohanim b'nei Acharon." Indeed, there is no special distinction made between the two primary priestly groups, the sons of Aaron and the other group known as the Levites. P consistently divides between them. For example, in Numbers 8, the Levites are under the authority of the priests, the sons of Aaron, who consecrate them for service in the tabernacle. It says, the Levites, Haleviim, went and performed their service in the tent of meeting before or under the authority of Aaron and his sons, Lifnei Acharon u'Lifnei Benav. But in D, no such distinction is made, and the entire priestly caste is consistently referred to collectively as the Levitical priests, the HaKohanim HaLevayim. They are all accorded with the same authority to perform all the same duties in the tent of meeting. There are distinctions in P and JE in the presentation of God's interaction with humankind. The God of J and E is decidedly more hands-on and directly participatory in his creation. In the J creation story of Genesis 2-3, God plants the garden. He molds its inhabitants from the dirt and breathes life into the first man. Later in the story, God is pictured walking in the garden and enjoying the evening breeze. Elsewhere, in the story of the Great Flood, God himself closes the door of the ark as the floodwaters increase, and he breathes in the aroma of Noah's sacrifice after they subside. In E, God wrestles with Jacob, and he stands upon the rock which Moses strikes in Meribah. Contrast these actions with how God is presented in P. In the P creation story, he creates by fiat, merely speaking everything into existence. And God said, and it was so. There is the careful avoidance throughout P of any sort of descriptions of God that might construe physicality, where in J, God is physically present, and where in E, he frequently makes appearances in visions, dreams, or through messengers. In P, God manifests in his glory, the Kavod Adonai. In P, there are no dreams, no angels, and no talking animals. Finally, both P and D separate themselves from the other sources by various other means. For P, it is a near obsessive concern with numbers, dates, order, and precision. We see this when contrasting the P and J versions of the flood story. The P version provides precise instructions and measurements for the ark, where J does not. It indicates the beginning of the flood in the 600th year of the life of Noah. In the second month, on the 17th day of the month, all the fountains of the deep broke open and the windows of the sky were opened. While in J, we read only that the flood was 40 days on the earth. In P, the ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month. The waters abated until the tops of the mountains appeared in the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, and Noah left the ark in his 601st year, on the 1st month, on the 1st day of the month. In J, we read only that the water subsided after 40 days, and that he left the ark another 2 weeks later, when the dove he dispatched to find land did not return to him. For D, the distinction is a fairly urgent insistence upon the centrality of a single location for the exclusive worship of Yahweh. In Deuteronomy 12:5-7, it says, "Look only to the site that Yahweh your God will choose amidst all your tribes as his habitation, to establish his name there. There you are to go, and there you are to bring your burnt offerings and other sacrifices, your tithes and contributions, your votive and freewill offerings, and the firstlings of your herds and flocks. Together with your households you shall feast there before Yahweh your God, happy in all the undertakings in which Yahweh your God has blessed you." Seasoned aficionados of biblical literature and history will recognize the historical setting for this intransigent insistence on the centrality of Yahweh worship in Jerusalem to the reign of Josiah in Judah in the mid-7th century BCE. In 2 Kings 22, we read the famous story of High Priest Hilkiah's discovery of the Book of the Law during temple renovations in or around 622 BCE. Upon this discovery, according to the text, Josiah responded with great consternation at having invoked the anger of Yahweh, because our fathers did not obey the words of this scroll to do all that has been prescribed to us. He vows publicly to follow Yahweh and keep his commandments, his decrees, and his statutes with all their heart and soul, that they would keep all the terms of this covenant as inscribed upon the scroll. Josiah then embarks on a sweeping campaign to remove all the objects of worship to other gods that were in the Jerusalem temple, all the utensils made for Baal and Asherah and all the host of heaven, the Asherah itself, the house of the male prostitutes at the place where the women wove tent coverings for Asherah, the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun, and the chariots of the sun, the altars made by Manasseh in the two courts of the house of Yahweh. In addition to restoring the temple, Josiah also eradicated the worship of gods other than Yahweh throughout Judah. He suppressed the idolatrous priests, whom the kings of Judah had appointed to make offerings at the high places in the towns of Judah and in the environs of Jerusalem, and those who made offerings to Baal, to the sun and the moon and constellations, and all the host of the heavens. He defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so that no one might consign his son or daughter to the fire of Moloch. The king also defiled the high places facing Jerusalem to the south of the Mount of the Destroyer, which King Solomon of Israel had built for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, for Milcom, the detestable thing of the Ammonites. But what is often missed by casual readers of this text is the crucial third step that Josiah took in his religious reformation. Not only did he extirpate worship and service to gods other than Yahweh, he completely eliminated all religious activity outside of the Jerusalem temple. He brought all the priests from the towns of Judah that defiled the high places where the priests had been making offerings, from Geba to Beersheba. He also demolished the high places of the gates, which were at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the city prefect, which were on the left of the city gate. The priests of the high places, however, did not ascend the altar of Yahweh in Jerusalem, but they ate unleavened bread along with their kinsmen. Moreover, at the altar at Bethel, the high place erected by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin, he pulled down the altar along with the high place. He burned the high place, crushing it to dust. He also burned the Asherah. Josiah removed all the shrines in the high places that were in the towns of Samaria, which the kings of Israel had made, provoking Yahweh to anger. He did to them just as he had done at Bethel. He sacrificed on the altars all of the priests of the high places who were there, and burned human bones on them. Then he returned to Jerusalem. These were not specified sites for the worship of other gods. These are sites dedicated to the worship of Yahweh outside of the Jerusalem temple that were in contravention to the prescription in Deuteronomy 12. Look only to the site that Yahweh your God will choose amidst all your tribes and his habitation, to establish his name there. There you are to go, and there you are to bring your burnt offerings and other sacrifices. An important side note here. In 2 Kings 23:20, King Josiah performs massive, multiple human sacrifices at each of the high places in Samaria. While most modern English translations read along the lines of, he slaughtered all the priests of the high places on the altars, there is absolutely no ambiguity in the Hebrew text. I think the point is a significant one, that this appears to be a series of human sacrifices that is sanctioned by Yahweh. It is a feature of Josiah's righteous religious reforms, and it is not ever condemned by God, nor by the text. So after returning to Jerusalem, Josiah oversaw a Passover celebration at the Jerusalem temple in accordance with what is written in this book of the covenant. No such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during all the days of the kings of Israel, or the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was kept to Yahweh in Jerusalem. This was also in clear correspondence with the instructions from Deuteronomy 12:7. Together with your households you shall feast there before Yahweh your God. Happy in all the undertakings in which Yahweh your God has blessed you. I have belabored the point, but it is a really important one. There is such a strong connection between the content of the book of Deuteronomy and Josiah's reform that rather sharply contrasts with other Pentateuchal texts. And these features distinguish it as a product of this period, and one composed to bolster the ambitious religious reforms of the late 7th century as opposed to the other way around. One of the enduring strengths of source theories for the construction of the Pentateuch is how seamless and logical the sources themselves are once separated from one another. That is, there is a narrative continuity within the sources themselves that rather breaks down, often in a puzzling manner, in how they've been compiled. This is most famously illustrated by comparisons between the J and P accounts of the flood story in Genesis 6-9. Another not so well known example appears in the contrast between the J and E accounts of Joseph's betrayal by his brothers, as recorded in Genesis 37. My apologies at this point to those of you who are viewing this on your phones, but it is informative to have a comprehensive visual presentation of the entire text on the whole to see the point that I am making. In one account is a story of Joseph's dreams of grandeur, which drive his brothers to seek his murder. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Once, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. He had another dream and told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I have had another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What kind of dream is this that you have had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow to the ground before you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." In the other story, Joseph's father, called Israel, not Jacob, favors him and gifts him with an elaborate chieftain's garment. This drives his brothers to seek his murder while tending the family flocks in Dothan. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." He answered, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. The man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." The man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. In the first story, Jacob's third son, Judah, intervenes to save the brothers from the guilt of Joseph's blood, and he is sold to the Ishmaelites, who take him to Egypt. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and not lay our own hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." So his brothers agreed, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." In the second story, it is the eldest brother, Reuben, not Judah, who intervenes and convinces them otherwise to throw Joseph into a pit. Reuben secretly hopes to retrieve Joseph and return him to his father, but in the meantime he is discovered by Midian traders, who kidnap Joseph and sell him into slavery in Egypt. To cover for Joseph's disappearance, the brothers cover the coat in goat's blood and tell their father that he was devoured by a wild animal. But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. When some Midian traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit. But then, when Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, "This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it and said, "This is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without a doubt torn into pieces." Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. When the stories were cleverly combined by a later redactor, they read as a more elaborate story. The jealousy of Joseph's brothers is compounded because of his dreams and also because of his father's fawning over him. Nevertheless, this newly formed narrative also survives with some perplexing discrepancies. First, in the story of the dreamer, Judah is the one who resolves to assuage the collective guilt of his brothers as would-be murderers, and instead sell Joseph as a slave to the Ishmaelites. However, in the story of Joseph's garment, it is rather his brother Reuben who saves his life by suggesting that his brothers instead cast him into a pit. Reuben has decided that he would secretly retrieve Joseph and return him to his father. In the newly combined story, Reuben first convinces his brothers not to kill Joseph, but rather to throw him into a pit. Then, Judah convinces his brothers again to not kill Joseph, but rather to sell him to the Ishmaelites. But this is only a fairly subtle oddity. The sources are combined in such a way that one brother rescues Joseph from murder by instead tossing him into a pit, and then another convinces his brothers that he should be sold into slavery. A much more glaring discrepancy is in what follows, where in the story of the dreamer, Joseph is sold to Ishmaelites. In the story of Joseph's garment, he is discovered and kidnapped by Midianites. This creates a very confusing situation in verses 27 to 28. First, Judah says to his brothers, "Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and lay not our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. Then, in verse 28, when some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. On the face of it, one is rightly perplexed about why the Midianites are even mentioned here. But the confusion is compounded further at the conclusion of the story, where we read in verse 36 that meanwhile the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. The result here is a mess, where the brothers resolve to sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, then Midianites arrive on the scene to sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, who take Joseph to Egypt, where he is sold by the Midianites to the household of Potiphar. Discrepancies such as these abound throughout the combined narrative that are easily resolved by restoration to their original sources. Even in one of Michael Jones's key examples, we can readily see the combination of sources at work. For this, we turn back to the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. If you watched the first video in this series, then you will recall this rendition of an impressive-looking chart Jones presented in his discussion of the Table of Nations. However, missing from his talk and obscured from a passing view of the table is the complex combination of material from two sources suggested by most scholars to be P and E. We can, on the surface of it, detect the subtle presence of the sources by noting the distinction in the rhetorical formulae used to introduce each independent genealogy, and by careful attention to syntactical and verbal patterns that are particular to each one. Because some of these differences are rather fine and only obvious in the original language, I will illustrate them using the Hebrew text. And even if you do not know the language or recognize the letters, I trust that the differences I will highlight are still obvious. First, notice at the outset how the table is introduced in Genesis 10, verse 1. These are the descendants of Noah's sons. In Hebrew, the phrase looks like this. And this is generally agreed to be a feature of the author of P, who some understand to be the author that combined and edited the sources into something close to what survives in our Bibles. This same formula is recurring throughout Genesis. The following 4 verses of the genealogy follow the same basic pattern. First, the formulaic introduction, Uvene, the sons of Japhet, followed by the list of descendants, and then a summation which includes these 4 elements: by their lands, with their own language, by their families, in their nations. The pattern repeats itself in verse 6. The sons of Ham, and then the sons of Cush, the firstborn son of Ham, in verse 7. However, at that point, there is an interruption in verse 8, where we see a clear change in the rhetorical formulas, thus introducing the second source into the genealogy. The second source, probably E, describes progeny differently. In verse 8, it says that Cush became the father of Nimrod. V'Cush yolad et Nimrod. The author here follows this with some editorializing about Nimrod, and then again, in verse 13, employs the same rhetorical pattern. Egypt became the father of. Umitzrayim yolad et. And then again, in verse 15, Canaan became the father of. Ucanaan yolad et. One of the key identifiers that distinguish the E genealogy from P is the usage of the untranslatable direct object marker et. It appears only in the E portions of this passage and never in the P sections. This itself is quite remarkable because of how ubiquitous this word is throughout the Hebrew Bible, appearing 4,164 times in the Pentateuch. 38 times it appears in Genesis 10, and here always and only in those sections that can be assigned to E. Another feature of this author is that the offspring of these great nations are not identified as individual sons as much, but rather as ethnic groups. Egypt became the father of the Ludim, the Anamim, the Lehavim, the Naphtuhim, the Pathrusim, the Kasluhim from whence came the Philistines, and the Kaphtorim. The distinction is not always obvious in the English, but it is abundantly clear in Hebrew, and especially if we transliterate each designation as opposed to its English translation. In verse 15, Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and Het, and the Yebusi, the Amori, the Gergashi, the Hivi, the Arki, the Sini, the Arvadi, the Simori, the Hamoti, after which the families of the Canaani, or the Canaanites, spread. Verse 19 continues from where the first source, P, left off with the sons of Ham: Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. The boundaries of the Canaanites from Sidon as far as Gerar, from Gaza as far as Sodom and Gomorrah, from Admah to Zeboim to Lasha. As with the genealogy of Japhet, so the genealogy of Ham ends with the same summation. These are the sons of Ham by their families, with their own language, by their lands, in their nation. Verse 21 is a strange text that appears like it probably originally belonged to E, but has been corrupted by P or another editor who stitched the whole thing together. It presently looks like an attempt to combine the sources and rather weirdly notes that Shem is the older brother of Japhet and the father of Eber. Verses 22 to 23 is the Shemite portion of this genealogy according to P. The sons of Shem: Elam, Ashur, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram: Uz, Hul, Geter, and Mash. Verses 24 to 28 list the offspring of Shem, beginning with his son Arpachshad. Arpachshad became the father to Shelah, and Shelah became the father to Eber. To Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Yoktan. The usage of the expression Arpachshad became the father of, V'Arpachshad Yalad et. Shelah became the father of, Ushelah Yalad et, align with the rhetorical pattern we see in E, but not in P. Verse 25 recounts the offspring of Shelah's son Eber, and with a bit of editorializing that is also not characteristic of P. Verses 26 to 28 begin in the same fashion as E, and also with the usage of the direct object marker et. Yoktan became the father of, Vayoktan Yalad et, Almodad, Shalef, Hazar Mavet, Yera, Hadoram, Uzal, Dikla, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Yovav. But then the verse ends with the formula similar to what we have seen throughout P. All these were the sons of Yoktan, Kolela bene Yoktan. Finally, verses 30 to 31 conclude with the same summation used by P for the sons of Japhet and the sons of Ham. The territory in which they lived extended from Meshah in the direction of Shephar, the hill country of the east. These are the descendants of Shem by their families, with their language, by their lands, in their nations. I trust that it is obvious what is going on here. These are two accounts of the same genealogy, then cleverly combined into one. Once the two are separated from the whole, the internal consistency in each one is abundantly clear, especially in the original language. The P genealogy very precisely follows an editorial pattern. First, the recounting of sons for each of Noah's sons, Japhet, Ham, and Shem. Second, a description of territory for each of the larger groups of descendants. Finally, a summation that includes the same four elements: families, language, lands, nations. The E genealogy is more fluid, contains editorializing about a pair of individuals, but also follows its own distinct rhetorical pattern. A man became the father of, etc. Unlike P, instead of listing each individual son, the author here identifies ethnic groups as they are descended from the patriarch. Once the sources are separated, the logic in each of them is pronounced. There are virtually dozens of examples throughout the Pentateuch where this same exercise can be repeated, yielding identical results, which rather strongly demonstrate the underlying existence of sources. So then, to recap the evidence presented in this video, the existence of sources in the Pentateuch is known through several doublets of the same stories, but in which key features are distinct, such as the name of God and the names of the main characters. There are terminological consistencies within each of the sources. Most notably, the mountain of God is known as Sinai in J and P, and then called Horeb in E and D. There are thematic and theological emphases that can be identified with each of the individual sources. God in J and E is physical and present. He speaks directly to people in J and through dreams in E. In P, he is distant and transcendent. P has a fixation with numbers and dates and shows a clear preference for the sons of Aaron in Israel's priesthood, where D always makes no distinction between the offices of the priests and the Levites. D is obsessed with the centralization of worship in Jerusalem and prohibits the offering of sacrifices in all other locations, whereas P features a portable tabernacle shrine. Finally, there is a narratological continuity that is easy to discern when the sources are separated, as we have illustrated in the two examples from the story of Joseph and in the Table of Nations. The documentary hypothesis is real, and it is formidable. Now, finally armed with a good grounding in the evidence for the source theories, it is time to address Jones's case for the internal consistency of Genesis. This will be the topic for the final video in this series.